dreamers. This is the Professional Dreamers podcast, and I'm your host, Jennifer Warren, back behind the black and blue mic and ready to get into it. You know, the evolution of business lobbying from a small reactive force into what we know today is a ubiquitous and increasingly proactive one is probably one of the most important transformations of American politics over the last 40 years. Today, most lobbyists are engaged in a system of, well, let's call it bribery, but it's the legal kind. The way it works is pretty simple. Basically, big business hands laws that they want to have passed over to elected leaders, and along with it, they give them a lot of cash. Elected leaders then pass whatever laws that big business wants. And the legislation and rules that get passed, obviously, favors big business. The United States Supreme Court has repeatedly told us that money is an absolutely protected form of speech. A string of cases, like Citizens United, has opened the barn door to unlimited amounts of dark money handed over to elected officials. And that dark money, of course, can come from anywhere, because dark money is simply money that doesn't have to be reported as to where it came from. This means that foreign governments can easily influence our laws and even our elections. The only time it becomes illegal is when that money comes from sources which are, well, let us say, known enemies that are attacking our country by using the internet or anything else. Then it becomes treason. Now, a lot of industries have become notorious for the millions of dollars that they spend on influencing legislation and bribing friendly candidates into office. Big oil, big pharma, King Coal, and of course the gun lobby are just a few, but one has managed to quickly build influence with, well, very little scrutiny. And that one is private prisons. The two largest for-profit prison companies in the United States, GEO and the Corrections Corporation of America, along with their associates, have funneled, roughly $25 million a year into lobbying efforts. And meanwhile, in return for all that lobbying, their private companies have seen their revenue and market share soar. They now rake in a combined $3.5 billion a year in revenue. And the private federal prison population has more than doubled. Now, there's a reason for this. It has nothing to do with getting tough on crime, which is what politicians love to argue. Because what it is there are contracts that require the government to keep correctional facilities and immigration detention centers full, which forces communities to continuously funnel people into the system, even if actual crime rates and illegal immigration are falling. Nearly 2/3 of private prison contracts mandate that governments maintain a minimum occupancy rate, usually around 90%, or taxpayers have to pay for the empty beds, just as though there were actual criminals in them. Now, there's even a lockup quota, and this is important, at the federal level. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention budget includes a mandate from Congress that at least 34,000 immigrants are detained on a daily basis. Now that's a quota that steadily grows every year, even though undocumented immigrants uh, have, have leveled off. Private prisons profit handsomely from that policy because they own 9 out of 10 of the largest ICE detention centers where children are thrown behind bars and forcibly drugged to keep them quiet. And that's according to a report released just this month by grassroots leadership. Now, opposition to criminal justice reform should render any candidate woefully inadequate to lead a nation that suffers from a prison system that essentially locks up people who are the least desirable members of society. When you're perpetuating the oppression of your most vulnerable citizens, like lesbians, gays, bis, transgendered, people who are not white, or as they like to put it, the wrong color, well, we can't allow the proliferation of private prisons and their political influence to remain the most important issue that nobody talks about. You know, in the first days of Trump's presidency, he signed an executive order on lobbying, which required that appointees sign a pledge swearing that they would never accept gifts from lobbyists. Well, that was bullshit because even though the pledge also said that appointees wouldn't lobby their former agency or on behalf of a foreign government for 5 years afterwards, he populated his administration with lobbyists. At least 187 of his political appointees were and are former federal lobbyists. And that's according to ProPublica, which is a watchdog group. It's literally become a field day for lobbyists. For Trump, it was really nothing more than campaign rhetoric. He isn't enforcing it, and he's not interested in enforcing it. He wanted to open the door to K Street, to send the signal that becoming a lobbyist is no barrier to getting senior federal positions. As a matter of fact, he considers it to be something you want to have on your resume. John Boehner is a good example of this. In March of 2016, the former speaker tweeted a photo of himself mowing his lawn in Ohio. It was the picture of a man happily retired and far removed from the stress of congressional life. But Boehner also signed on with the D.C.-based Squire Patton Boggs, which has, even though they have an office in Cincinnati, Boehner is frequently spotted around D.C. You know, John Ehrlichman, who was part of the Nixon White House, said this: the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Scientific evidence to back up placing a drug at that level of control. The law clearly says that that marijuana has to be, in order to be made a Schedule I drug, has to be too dangerous to handle even under supervision of a trained supervisor. It has to be a drug that has no medical value, and that there is scientific evidence to show that it's actually deadly, or at least harmful. Well, there is no such scientific evidence because none was ever done. And the reason none was ever done was because part of the law says that in order to conduct scientific testing, the approval of Congress is required. And since Congress only approves testing that is designed to prove that marijuana is deadly, it's not really interested in scientific testing, because when you make an assumption that something should come out in a certain way before you begin the testing, you're not looking for the truth. You're simply looking for excuses to back up what you've already done. As far as the corruption regarding guns goes, at the beginning of the film The Lord of War, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's a great film. The character Yuri Orlov, which was brilliantly played by Nicolas Cage, says this: there are over 550 million firearms in worldwide circulation. That's one firearm for every 12 people on the planet. The only question is, how do we arm the other 11? Well, welcome to the world of American gun running, and start thinking about Donald Trump as our very own gun runner-in-chief. The NRA has an enthusiastic ally in the president, and they have vigorously backed him with over $30 million in ads that either praised him or trashed Hillary Clinton in order to back his efforts to become president. And right now, they are backing his efforts to deregulate gun exports to the hilt. Now, this is kind of interesting because one of the biggest threats that's posed by Trump's approach to guns is his administration's decision to settle a case with Defense Distributed, which is a Texas-based firm that's run by Cody Wilson. Cody Wilson, of course, is the guy that wants to usher in the age of the downloadable gun. Now, even though a Seattle-based judge intervened to stop him for the time being, the government green-lighted Wilson's posting of designs on the internet that could be easily used to produce plastic guns on 3D printers. Plastic guns, the kind of thing that you could use to take over an aircraft in flight, because you could just walk through the metal detectors, take over an aircraft while it's in flight, and fly it into a building. Fortunately, nobody's ever forced a plane to fly into a building before. Well, other than 9/11. But, I'm sure that terrorists don't have access to the internet, right? I mean, they can't afford computers. They can only afford $1,000 plane tickets. Yeah, right. Well, when that happens, when his designs are used to produce these plastic guns, it will undoubtedly prove a global bonanza for anybody who wants a weapon and who's capable of either purchasing a printer or knows somebody who has one anywhere in the world. Now, Donald Trump does claim that there's a flood of criminals washing across the U.S.-Mexico border, which is interesting because he conveniently ignores the fact that America's export of violence in the other direction goes on a regular basis, thanks to both legal and illegal transfers of guns to Mexico and Central America. The United States is, in short, already effectively weaponizing both criminal networks and repressive security forces in those countries. But selling death and destruction isn't a really great job creator. Military spending actually creates a lot fewer jobs per dollar than almost any other kind of investment. In fact, most of those jobs will be located overseas thanks to production sharing deals